Samsung is everywhere, in your hand, in your home, and even in the heart of your decisions. Yes, it's that serious. But what if I told you it all started with a college dropout selling dried fish and noodles during one of the poorest periods in history? This is the untold story of how Lee Byung-chul built Samsung and how his small trading company would eventually take over the world. The true story behind Samsung's empire is far more daring, brutal, and brilliant than most people realize. To understand Samsung's global dominance and how, let's take a step back to when it all began. In 1938, in the city of Daegu, Korea, Lee Byung-chul founded a small company named Samsung Sangho. At the time, Korea was under harsh Japanese occupation, and the economy was shattered. Lee, who had recently dropped out of Waseda University in Tokyo, started the business with just 40 employees. His company's name, Samsung, meant 3 stars, symbolizing greatness, power, and eternity. But in reality, survival, not greatness, was Lee's first priority. Samsung's early operations were humble. They traded dried fish, local groceries, and handmade noodles, providing basic supplies to a country struggling under colonial rule. The odds were against Lee from the very beginning. He was building a business during one of the hardest eras in Korean history. By August 15, 1945, Korea gained independence as a result of Japan's surrender in the Pacific War. But the hope was short-lived. The Korean War broke out in June 1950, plunging the country into chaos again. Factories were destroyed, millions were displaced, and by 1953, Korea's GDP per capita had fallen to a shocking $67, one of the lowest in the world, according to the World Bank. Instead of retreating, Lee Byung-chul adapted. He pivoted Samsung into industries that Korea desperately needed to survive and rebuild. He launched Cheiljedang, a sugar refinery, to produce Korea's first domestically made sugar. He also started Cheil Industries, focusing on textiles, another critical shortage in the war-torn economy. These moves weren't random. They were strategic survival decisions. Sugar and textiles were basic goods that Korea could no longer import reliably after the war. By producing them domestically, Samsung became not just a business, but a crucial part of South Korea's recovery. By the end of the 1950s, Samsung's sugar refinery had become the largest in South Korea. Its textile operations followed closely, employing thousands at a time when jobs were scarce. In many Korean households, Samsung was no longer just a brand. It was a symbol of hope and resilience. Behind these bold expansions was Lee Byung-chul's relentless ambition. He wasn't content with simply surviving. He wanted Samsung to lead, not follow, in rebuilding the new Korea. His strategy reflected an important truth. When a country needed to stand on its own feet, companies that solved real national problems would grow the fastest. Lee understood this better than anyone, and Samsung became a quiet but unstoppable force in Korea's industrial rise. By the early 1960s, Samsung was no longer just a trading company. It was rapidly transforming into a national champion, and Lee Byung-chul was just getting started. By the mid-1960s, Samsung was already dominant in Korea's basic industries: sugar, textiles, fertilizer, even insurance. But Lee Byung-chul wasn't satisfied. He realized that real power in the coming decades would come from technology, not commodities. So in 1969, he made a move that shocked many of his peers. He founded Samsung Electronics. At the time, South Korea didn't even have the basic infrastructure to support a tech company. There were no advanced factories, no experienced engineers. Even Japan, Korea's former colonizer, still heavily imported its electronic components from the United States. But Lee Byung-chul believed that if Korea wanted to be strong, it needed to master the future industries itself. He poured millions of Korean won into research, hired foreign consultants, and formed partnerships to learn as much as possible. Samsung's first products were humble: black and white televisions, electric fans, and refrigerators. Their first TV, released in 1970, was the P3202, and it quickly captured a huge share of Korea's small but growing consumer market. Still, Samsung was seen internationally as a cheap manufacturer, not an innovator. In fact, throughout the 1970s, most of Samsung's electronics were licensed products built under agreements with Japanese and American firms. But Lee had a long-term plan. He wasn't trying to compete immediately. He was building capabilities quietly, preparing for a time when Samsung could stand on its own. In 1974, Samsung made a massive and highly risky acquisition: a struggling semiconductor company called Korea Semiconductor. At that time, even experts doubted Korea could ever produce competitive chips. Manufacturing semiconductors required clean rooms, precision engineering, and billions of dollars in R&D. But Lee believed in going where others were afraid. He once said, quote, "Samsung must forge into unknown industries that others fear to enter." By investing in semiconductors, Samsung positioned itself early in a field that would later dominate the global economy. Meanwhile, the Korean government under President Park Chung-hee aggressively supported industrial giants like Samsung. Through policies known as the 5-year economic plans, the government provided cheap loans, protected local companies from foreign competition, and pushed for exports. Between 1962 and 1979, South Korea's GDP grew by an average of 8.9% per year, one of the fastest rates in the world. Samsung, along with a few other conglomerates like Hyundai and LG, was at the center of this miracle. These companies, called chaebols, meaning family-owned business groups, dominated the Korean economy and politics alike. But success came with its own risks. By the late 1970s, Samsung was powerful but heavily diversified. Some experts worried that it was stretched too thin across too many industries: construction, shipbuilding, chemicals, and now electronics. Even Lee Byung-chul faced criticism from both inside and outside the country. There were allegations of monopolistic behavior, labor issues, and cozy ties with politicians. But Lee remained focused on his mission. He once explained, quote, "Economic power must precede political independence." In 1987, after nearly 5 decades of building Samsung, Lee Byung-chul passed away. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of Samsung's ambitions. Leadership passed to his third son, Lee Kun-hee, who would take everything his father built and push it even further. When Lee Kun-hee took over Samsung after his father's death in 1987, he inherited a company that was big but not admired globally. Samsung was seen as a follower, not a leader. Its products were considered cheap imitations, not world-class innovations. Lee Kun-hee knew this had to change. In 1993, he gathered top executives in Frankfurt, Germany, for a secret, now famous meeting called the Frankfurt Declaration. There, he delivered a brutal message. He said, quote, "Change everything except your wife and children." He demanded a complete cultural overhaul of Samsung, from manufacturing to design to branding. It was no longer enough to be the biggest, Samsung had to be the best. Immediately after the meeting, Lee Kun-hee slashed nearly 90% of Samsung's product lineup to focus only on high-quality goods. He invested billions into research and development. By 1995, Samsung had built 17 new R&D centers around the world. One bold bet was in memory chips. In 1992, Samsung became the world's largest producer of DRAM, dynamic random access memory. Today, Samsung still controls around 40% of the global DRAM market, according to Statista's 2024 data. But the biggest transformation came in consumer electronics. In 2009, Samsung released its first Galaxy smartphone running on Google's Android system. At that time, Apple's iPhone had already redefined the smartphone industry. Many thought no one could challenge Apple's dominance. But Samsung didn't just copy the iPhone. They innovated fast. Samsung introduced larger screens, OLED displays, waterproofing, styluses with the Galaxy Note series, and advanced cameras. In fact, Samsung was the first major manufacturer to mass-produce OLED displays at scale. By 2012, Samsung had overtaken Apple to become the world's largest smartphone maker by volume, according to International Data Corporation, IDC. That same year, Samsung shipped over 215 million smartphones compared to Apple's 135 million. But success wasn't smooth. Between 2011 and 2018, Samsung and Apple fought a brutal legal war across more than 50 lawsuits in 10 different countries. The dispute stemmed from allegations that Samsung infringed on Apple's patents for iPhone design and features, leading to a complex and international legal process. The legal battle spanned several years and involved numerous court rulings, eventually leading to a settlement in 2018. Today, when you hold a Samsung phone or see a Samsung logo light up a skyscraper in New York or Paris, you're witnessing the legacy of Lee Byung-chul and Lee Kun-hee, a legacy built not on privilege, but on the courage to bet everything against impossible odds.